meeting that we can actually record it, and people like that. So, okay, so we're just going to go through pretty much everything in accounts payable today. And so I've got sample data on the screen. Of course, you know, things are going to look a little different from what you're going to see simply because the vendors are going to be different. And of course, the data is sample data. So don't be alarmed. That's still absolutely going to be what you're going to do. So I want you all to feel free to stop and ask me questions. And sometimes with these conference calls, if I'm talking, you know, I might not actually, I might kind of over talk or talk over you because maybe I don't hear you. So just keep talking and asking until you know, make sure I've heard you. And I want to address any questions that you have. So we're going to go through AP setup. Now, a lot of this is not going to be something that you guys are going to have to do, but understanding everything in the accounts payable setup will help you understand how the system works. And if you run into something, it might be just a simple matter of changing something up in the setup. So the first thing we're going to do in AP setup is we're going to look at our options. So this information is your company information, and that comes from common services. Common services are things that are common to all the modules. So of course your company name and address is going to be, you know, the same for whether you're in AR or AP or general ledger or whatever. So on the processing tab, these are your AP processing options. So under here, we've got forced listing of all batches, and generally this is now unchecked. What that would do is prevent you from posting any batch unless it had been printed out. And generally speaking, that can be rather annoying. So we don't generally force that printout to happen, okay? So the next thing is allow edit of imported batches. So if for some reason you import an AP batch from an external system like Excel, this feature would allow you to edit it. And this is probably, honestly, you're probably not really going to import anything generally.
Probably
allow edit of, sorry?
I was going to say, I probably will just at the beginning.
Yeah, you will. So you're absolutely going to want to leave this checked, Peach.
Yeah.
Yeah, you may very well import an opening AP batch, okay?
Yeah.
I will caution you that accounts payable is really kind of a pain in the neck to import because there's so many pieces that you have to include, but we can talk about that at another time.
Okay.
Allow edit of external batches. An external batch would be something that comes from another module within Sage, such as purchase orders, which I don't think you have, so this feature isn't really going to apply. Retainage accounting, that's really for construction, and you will not be using that either, but what retainage is if you're doing retainage and I'm a supplier and or a subcontractor and I send you a bill for $100, you might retain 10%, in other words, not pay 10% until the job is complete and satisfactory, but you're not using that, so that's something you will not check. Keep statistics, there's no reason not to choose this because you want to keep your statistics. The statistics like highest balance this year, last invoice, total number of year-to-date payments, and so on. Allow edit of statistics, that would allow you to edit these. You know, there's really no reason to do so. Allow tax and statistics, you're not retaining, or you're not calculating sales tax from within AP, so that checkbox is not really going to have any bearing. Accumulate statistics by calendar or fiscal year. You guys are a calendar year, so this is not actually going to make any difference because calendar year, fiscal year is the same. And then period type, you can actually keep statistics by week or bi-weekly, monthly. I would just leave this at fiscal period because that's generally what people want. So this area, aging, so typically it's 30, 60, 90. That is the default, but within accounts payable, you might want to change this to something like 7, 14, 21 or something like that, because in accounts payable, you really aren't going to know nothing is, you're probably not going to know what's, you know, over 90 days or whatever. But, you know, generally it's 30, 60, 90, but you can change that if you want. Aging of unapplied credit notes. So if a vendor sends you a credit note and you haven't applied it to a specific invoice, how do you want that to show up on your aging? And typically people just have that show up in the current column. So that's what that does. And unapplied prepayments. So if you send a vendor a prepayment against an invoice that you have not entered yet, that would typically be aged as current as well. Default number of days to keep vendor comments, 999 is the maximum, and that's probably what you're going to want. So on the transaction type, we've got invoicing options. So default posting date, we'll be looking at that when we look at our transactions, but in accounts payable and throughout the system, you've got 2 dates. You've got the invoice date or the document date, and then the posting date. Posting date drives when it's going to land in the general ledger. So this allows you to set a default, and so there's 3 dates used. The document date, of course, is going to be the invoice date or the credit note date. The batch date, when you're entering a batch of invoices, you can default the posting date to whatever you use when you batch or when you create the batch. The session date is the login date for Sage. So you can look at the session date down here in the lower right of your screen. That shows you your login date. The sample date is all 2020, hence the future date in this. But generally it would be today's date. Typically people want to put the transaction to the GL as of the, you can change that. Tax amount and tax base, we're not going to bother with because you're not tracking sales tax, okay, in the accounts payable. So really that's not going to have any effect. 1099 CPRS. So 1099, of course, we all know what that is. CPRS is the Canadian equivalent. So that's what that is. But you know, it's 99 purposes of us in the U.S. So yes, we do want to turn on 1099 reporting, and at this point, we do want to allow edit of 1099 amounts in case we don't capture 1099 amount for a vendor. That would allow you to add at a later date. Default 1099 amount, what that does is if I have an invoice for $100, it's going to default that $100 total is also going to land in the 1099 amount. The reason it can differ is, say I send you an invoice and part of it is for an expense reimbursement, so only the $100 is 1099able, but the $10 expense reimbursement or mileage or whatever is not, so you can actually change that. Typically it's going to be the same, so you would want that amount to default, and once again you will see that in invoice entry when we get to that point. Default detailed tax class, again, we're not tracking sales tax and AP, so we don't even need to check that. So that's invoice options. Payment options, so we've got a number of different payment types in accounts payable. So when you're doing a payment, the payment types would be payment, of course, and a payment would be where you're paying something that has been entered already as an invoice in accounts payable. Prepayment is going to be just like it says, just like it would suggest, where you're entering a prepayment against a document that you have not yet posted in AP, so that really wouldn't be what you would be defaulting, I don't think. Apply document is where you've got a prepayment and you want to apply it to an invoice. And then last of all is miscellaneous payment, and that is where you're entering a payment for something that has not yet been entered in accounts payable. So if someone comes in and they need a check immediately, you can enter the invoice and the payment all in at once. Okay. So typically your default is going to be payment. So the default order of open documents. So when you're looking at the payment screen, this is going to govern what the default order of all open documents is. So document number, if you're tracking POs, you can sort it by PO number, due date, order number probably isn't going to apply. Document number or document date, current balance or original document number. You're probably going to want to either use invoice number or document date. And once again, when we're looking at a payment batch, you'll see, that this will make a little more sense. The default bank code, so that's the default for the bank that you're going to use in your AP batch. Sage allows you, of course, to have as many bank accounts as you need. So in accounts payable, you can say, you can specify what the default bank is, okay? Default payment code is typically going to be check. You can also have, you can see all kinds of different payment codes, so check, cash, Visa, whatever. You might also have something like online if you're paying something online, or ACH or what have you. But typically people's default payment type is going to be check. So checking for duplicate check numbers. So you can choose to have no notification or warning or an error. So that would tell you whether you've used a check number already, okay? People want a warning, okay? So sorting checks by transaction entry number, vendor number, pay name. So these, again, are options for your sort order for checks. The posting date, this is the same as the invoice options where, it's probably going to be your check date. So I think document date is what you're going to want. Include pending transactions. So a pending transaction is a transaction that is in a batch, but that batch is not yet posted. So you want to include pending transactions because what that allows you to do is show pending transactions if you're looking up vendor activity, or if if you've got a pending payment batch, you don't want to create another payment batch for the same thing. So payments and adjustments is pretty typical. Allow adjustments in payment batch. So if you're going to pay a bill, we'll use our $100 example, but the vendor, maybe you had a dispute or something and you want to make an adjustment at the time you're doing the payment batch to write off that extra little amount, that allows you to do so. Remit to information. So if you have multiple remit to addresses, or if you want to change that in a payment batch, when you're creating the payment batch, you can do that, and you'll see that again once we're in transactions. And system-generated batches. So a system-generated batch would be a check run, and you probably do want to edit that. So if it is included, say, an invoice that you want to push off to the next payment run, this check mark would let you do that. Numbering in accounts payable, this is your automatic numbering for things like recurring payables, which we'll look at, payments, prepayments, or adjustments. So this allows you to determine the length. The default is 22. I would say you do not need 22 because that's going to make for a lot of leading zeros. So for a recurring payable, you would have RP, then 21 zeros, and then a 1, okay? That's kind of long. So I usually recommend people change it to either 10 or 15 so you don't have all those leading zeros and doing that across all down here, okay? And that's editable. You can see I can change that.
Would that be something we should look at to see how many transactions we've had in a year?
No.
No?
This is just the numbering of recurring payments. So if you do a recurring term payment right now, so I've got 15 and the next number is 129. So RP, that's 2 characters. 129 is 3. So it would be RP and then 10 zeros and then 129. That's how that's for auto numbering of transactions. Okay. This is not check numbers. And of course your invoice numbers, that is not going to be determined by the system. It's going to be determined by your vendor, okay?
Right. So
this is just for auto numbering, and that's the same if any of you work in the accounts receivable. That's the same setup with AR. And then this next invoice, payment, adjustment, batch, etc. That's not editable. That just shows what the next batch number is, okay? And then for you guys, the retainage tab is not going to exist because you have not turned on retainage, nor do you. So that's for setup options in accounts payable. The next icon we'll talk about is account sets. So your account sets determine certain GL defaults. So for instance, trade accounts payable in the sample data. This, of course, here's your description, you know, and then you've got the payables control account, purchase discount, prepayment, which is an asset, prepayment, and then retainage, you will not have that field. But this determines your AP account number and what purchase discounts and prepayment. Peach, how many AP control accounts do you guys have? Probably just one, or do you have multiple?
I think we have one at this time, just one. Going into the new company, we had several, but now we'll just have one.
Okay, some people, you know, might set up an employee payables or, you know, whatever, but honestly, it's sort of 6 one, half a dozen another. But this dictates things like you can print out by control account set, and of course it determines what liability account is hit when you enter an invoice, okay? That's control account sets, and that's a set it and forget it kind of thing. You know, you guys aren't really, once it's set up, you're not going to really go in here. All right, so 1099 codes. Okay, so this comes with the system, all right? And if I expand that, this determines what kind of 1099s you're tracking, and you assign that within the vendor. Typically, it's going to be 7, which is non-employee compensation, but you might have rents, and you might have other things as well. So this would determine what kind of accounts payable, what kind of 1099 you're tracking, and of course, where it's going to print when you enter a 1099 accounts payable. Okay, so when you print those 1099s, there are different boxes. So whatever you've chosen here is going to determine where it's going to print on the 1099.
And this is something new for us here. So we'll meet on that to kind of go over 1099 reporting later in more detail.
Okay.
But yes, take us all the way through so they see how it works.
Yeah, we will. So this is just the codes, and again, these codes come with Sage 300, so you pretty much don't have to do anything here, but, you know, just know that this is where they're stored, and, you know, that's pretty much all you have to know. A minimum amount to report, so like for employee compensation, number 7, you can see that it's set to 600, which, as we all know, if you pay someone less than $600 in a year, you don't have to send them a 1099. So that's important. Okay. Distribution codes, this is optional, but what a distribution code is it's kind of a shortcut to use when you're entering accounts payable. So, I mean, you certainly can use your general ledger account number, but some people like to set up distribution codes, which are just kind of shortcuts. You can see some of them here. Again, it's an optional thing that you don't actually have to use. That's where you would set them up. Corresponding to distribution codes or distribution sets. So that's actually a reason why you might want to set up some distribution codes. So let's see. So let's find a good example. So say you do employee reimbursements and, you know, maybe somebody goes out and buys office supplies or something, or maybe someone has travel expense. You might want to set up a distribution set, because then when you put in an invoice, you can call this distribution setup, and then it'll populate all those GL accounts that you've set up in this list. You don't have to pick them out. So that's where distribution codes can actually be useful. Honestly, that's really the only reason I can think of to use them, because it's just as easy to use distribution, or, you know, use the finder to find, you know, select distribution, GL distributions, okay? And we'll talk about that again when we get to accounts payable invoice. Terms, you can set up just about any kind of terms that you can imagine. So some of the typical ones are, of course, 2%, 10 days, net 30. So you want to set up all the terms that you've got, and then, of course, anytime you get an invoice that has a terms that maybe you haven't set up, you can come in here under setup and add those terms. So 210 net 30, of course, and here's your terms description. Of course, you want to, if it's an inactive terms code, you can check here. You're going to leave the tax. It doesn't matter what you do here again, because we're not tracking terms. So we've got two things we're dealing with in terms. We've got the due date and the discount type. So you can have both, of course. So in this instance, the percent due is 100% due in 30 days with a 2% discount in 10 days, okay? So looking at our due date type, so we've got days from invoice date, all right, so 30 days, 15 days, 0 days, whatever. You could also have an invoice term that's due on the end of the next month. So if I send you an invoice for the 15th, then it's due the next month on the last day of the month. You might have, like, for your credit cards or your utility bills, at least in Maryland, is due on a day of the month. So that might be, you know, the 15th of next month or something like that. Days from day of next month, so maybe it's after the 15th of next month or something like that. And then you've got due date table, which is really complicated. So that would be, let's see if we can find an example of that. That's kind of, I think it's pretty convoluted, but there are, like, some utilities do this. So due table, here's an example. So if your invoice date is between the 1st and the 10th, then it's due on the 15th. If the invoice is from the 11th to the 20th, it's due on the 25th. If it's 21st to the 31st, it would be due on the 5th of the following month. So add months and then day of month. I've honestly, in my years of doing this, I've never run into a vendor that does this, but there's got to be one somewhere, or they wouldn't have put it in there. But if you do have that, you can set it up. You can also set up a multi-table or multi-payment situation. So maybe a 90-day multiple payment, so 50% due in 30 days, 30% in 60, 20% on 90, and you can get discounts, you know, if you pay them early. You can also do, let's just show you how to set up a brand new term. So I'm going to hit new. I'm just going to say receipt, and this is due receipt. And it's going to be day from invoice date, payment number date 1 is due in 0 days. In other words, it's due on the day it's sent. So that's all you have. So if we did something like 1% in 10 days, so maybe we say 1, 10, 30 or something like that. So 1% days at 30. So the due date is 1 payment. It's due in 30 days. The discount is 1%, and that's in 10 days. You set up as many as you need. You can add to it any time. And then when you add a vendor, you would assign one of these terms code to that vendor. Okay. Does anyone have any questions on terms?
And of course, these are all set up in the system,
right.
So we can go over those again if anyone does.
Yeah, so yeah, absolutely. But if you run into some vendor that has some bizarro kind of term situation, this is where you would add to that, okay? So payment codes, all right? So payment codes, of course, you've got cash, if you're paying something with petty cash. Check is the typical. I mean, we're still using checks, but I do, okay, so US dollars, you're not multi-currency, so you wouldn't have this. Here's where people have set up credit card type payments. I mean, you might have something like, I personally have one called online. I pay online. Bigger companies typically don't do this, but I would call this a cash type payment because it comes directly out of my checking account. You might also have an ACH because it comes directly out of my checking account. But again, you can set up as many kinds of payment types or payment codes, sorry, that you need. Email messages, if you've got some sort of email situation where you want to send something to vendors, you can do that. So that's where you would set this up, okay? GL integration, so this determines how accounts payable integrates to your general ledger. And again, this is going to be a set it and forget it kind of thing, but it's important for you to understand how it works. So this is where in general ledger, any transaction that comes with AP is going to have a source ledger of AP, of course, and then the source type will be this of these abbreviations. So credit note, CR, APIN. So this is how someone who's reviewing general ledger transactions would be able to say, oh yes, this came from accounts payable and it was an invoice, or this was a repayment or something like that. Okay, once again, you're not going to change this, but if you want to look at what, you know, how this all works, you would take a look at that. Create GL transactions. Typically, people do it by posting. Back in the days of DOS, you would do a thing that would send the general ledger batch to AP. Personally, that's just extra work. And I like during posting because then you get that one-to-one relationship. So for every posting in AP, whether it's an AP invoice or a payment batch or adjustments, you would get a corresponding GL batch. So how do you want to create GL transactions? So your options are adding to an additional batch, which would be any open AP batch, creating a new batch, creating and posting a new batch. I would go with either number 2 or number 3. What number, creating a new batch would just create a GL batch, which then the person in the general ledger would go and post. A few versions ago, quite a few versions ago, they added this creating and posting. I personally like this because what that does is when you post in AP, it also goes in and posts in general ledger. And that's kind of nice because then you don't have to go and post in the GL. And the other thing is there's really little reason not to do this because you're not going to edit, nor should you ever edit a batch that's coming from AP because that could throw off the reconciliation between accounts payable and GL. So that's going to be probably a decision that Peach is going to make, but that's, you know, that's the implication, Peach. So you can decide how you want to do that. And so this complicated looking screen, I'm going to maximize it. This determines what goes into the GL when you post any kind of transaction in accounts payable. So you'll have in your general ledger batches, you're going to have header information, and then you're going to have detail. And the detail is going to be your line items, your debit and credits. So setting this up is going to determine what lands in the general ledger. So when you're looking at transactions, you'll be able to see, for instance, in the detail reference, okay, this is my vendor number and vendor name, and then in the detail description, maybe invoice, and then, okay. So this again, each what I would do is I'd kind of play with this company, and then you can figure out how you want this to look. But that's going to be important for your general ledger detail listings and what lands in your GL. Okay.
Okay.
So I don't know if we really want to go dive into this super in great.
Why don't we look at this? I'll look at this, and then we can talk together on that.
Because that's not really, but this again, you're going to figure out what you want it to do. You're really never going to come in here unless you say, you know what, I kind of would rather it do this, and then you might edit it.
Sure.
Okay, payment selection codes. The payment selection codes are exactly what it sounds. It's when you're doing a check run in accounts payable, how do you want to select your vendors, your things that you're going to pay? So in this example, all is what it sounds like. It's going to be all vendors that are due, okay? So set up a default bank, and then you're going to set up criteria. So all selected documents are going to be everything that's due, and then you're going to choose all vendor groups, all vendor numbers. So in Sage, this nothing to ZZZ, that would be everything. So the lowest vendor number to the highest, and ZZZ or ZZZZZ, whatever, is going to be the highest vendor number you could have in your range. A lot of people make the mistake of saying, you know, blanking these out. Well, if you do that, then you're going to get nothing. Because nothing to nothing is going to give you nothing, okay? So generally, you're going to leave this range unless you just want one vendor, and then you might say vendor number ABC01 to ABC01. And then exclusions, you might have exclusions. So I want to pay everybody, but this one, because maybe they're in a different, generally all is going to be exactly what it sounds like, all. So looking at some of these others, all vendors, it's the same, and there's no. So maybe all except these guys, or you know, whatever. They're just inventory vendors, etc. So when we look at creating a payment batch, it will make a little more sense. So this basically is going to govern the defaults that you choose when you're creating a payment batch. And then optional fields, this is where you set up optional fields, and I think we've set up one for personal property, and do I have that up here? I don't. The personal property is something that Peach and I set up for you to track personal property, okay? So at the, let me actually, I think I've got this on my other server actually, but Peach, do you want to go into this or do you want to just review that with them?
You know what, we're going to meet afterwards. Maybe I'll just walk them through that piece when we're all huddled around my computer.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's actually where you set it up. So we've now covered everything in AP setup, and once again, you're not really going to need to go into this area very often unless occasionally you might need to set up a new terms or something like that. So now we're going to go into AP vendors, and we're going to go through all of that. So the first thing before you can set up a vendor, you've got to set up your vendor groups. In accounts payable, you need to have at least one vendor group. Vendor groups are where you can slice and dice your vendor and group them in different ways. So, for instance, in the sample data, we've got inventory purchases. Well, you're not really doing that. Well, you might actually be, but they also have, well, they a couple kind of inventory purchases, miscellaneous purchases, services. Peach, how many vendor groups do you guys have?
Vendor group. I think we, I don't remember.
Okay, that's all right. You can
have a few.
A few, okay.
Yeah.
So what happens in a vendor group is it sets certain defaults for your vendors. So when you're adding a vendor, you assign them to a group, and then what's going to happen is it's going to assign the account set, the terms default, the default bank you pay them with, and then the payment code. And it's also going to default your inventory, your distribution. So you can distribute by GL code, distribution set, or none. So, and then your duplicate invoice checking, of course, you probably want that turned on at least to a warning for vendor and amount. Well, maybe not actually. So basically what that would say is for this vendor, if you've got an invoice that you posted last month for $100 and you get another one for $100, do you want it to check for duplicate invoices? That could be actually quite annoying because, you know, for a recurring vendor, you might have certainly multiple invoices, same amount, okay? Same with vendor and date. You might want to have that turned on. So it might say, hey, you already have an invoice for November 30th for this vendor. Are you sure? You might want to turn that warning on, okay? That's optional. Tax group, you're going to have one tax group set up. Everyone has to have at least one tax. It has to be assigned a tax group, even though everything's set to 0 and you're not actually tracking tax. The other tax thing is, and that's 1099 for you. So that's whether you're going to turn it on. You might set up vendor group by like whether they're 1099able. That could be a way.
We've already coded them, and I'm importing that. So we have a variety of groups. So 1099 has already been assigned to all of those, and we're assigning corp to those that with W-9s that do not require the 1099. So we've done that.
Excellent. So yeah, so this is just like I said, a way to set defaults, which is convenient when you're adding a vendor, and also there's certain reports you can do by vendor group and certain things you can do by vendor group. So it's a way again to slice and dice your vendors. Optional fields, again, that's something that would be set up, and Peach is going to talk to you about the personal property, which I believe is the only thing that we've set up, but I could be wrong. And then the last thing, of course, is statistics are maintained by vendor group as well as by vendor. So you can look at, you know, year-specific or statistics. You've got year-to-date, for 2020 and 2019 in this example. And that's just going to accumulate as you're using the system. So you can look and see at a glance what you've done with a certain vendor group, over the years. And that's vendor groups. So once you've set up your vendor groups, then you set up your vendors. So here we are. I'm going to just pull up a vendor here. For this information, you assign a vendor number. What are your vendor numbers, Peach? Are they alphanumeric?
Yes.
Good. Okay. So
we're actually starting from scratch because we're pulling in from two different databases. So we're going to do an alphanumeric.
Yeah, I like alphanumeric because it gives your accounts payable staff, a fighting chance to actually remember numbers. So this is sample data, but if I had created the sample data, this vendor would be CHL01, some sort of alphanumeric.
That's what we're doing.
And then if you've got two that starts with CHL, then you just have CHL02. So it gives your people a fighting chance to, anticipate what the vendor number is. And of course, this is a vendor name. This is going to dictate what shows up on their check for the most part. And then, of course, you assign a vendor group here. If you've got some sort of business registration number, you can put it here. Short name is just an abbreviation for the vendor, and it's something like the first 10 or so characters. And again, that has to do with sorting. So generally, you just let it default to whatever. Legal name, you can enter that here. It's usually the same. And then, of course, the address, you've got 4 lines for the street. So it might be, 104 Main Street and then Suite 105 and whatever. Okay, so that's pretty self-explanatory, as is city, state, and zip and country. Phone number, of course, and then you can assign an email on a website if you've got it. Second tab, of course, contact. So this would be your vendor contact and then his or her phone number and email. Processing. So this is where it gets interesting because this actually affects how you deal with this vendor. So account set, that's going to be probably the same for all your vendors. Okay, so that's going to determine things like the liability account that you use when you enter an AP invoice, the terms for this vendor, the bank you use to pay, and the payment code. And this all comes from your vendor group, okay? But it can be edited here, all right? Check language, of course, it's always going to be English. Delivery method, this would be for communications, email. This checkbox, you probably would never want to check, but what this would do is generate a separate check for each invoice. So if you're paying an invoice vendor, you have 3 invoices you're paying, that would generate 3 checks. Not sure why anyone would want that, but there it is. Credit limit, if you've got one for the vendor, you can enter it here. Invoicing. So once again, this is your distribution. This is how it's going to send information by default to the GL. So I usually use either distribution set or GL account. So using GL account, that allows you to choose the general ledger account number. So this brings me to the finder. So anytime you have an indexed field in Sage, you will see this little magnifying glass. So you can see here by the vendor number, by the account, by the group, and by all these options here, okay? So what that allows you to do is look things up. So if I just click on this finder, okay, it's going to show me a list of GL accounts. I can also access any finder field with the F5 function key. So I press on 5, finder, and right now, this just gives me a list of, this is my whole chart of accounts. Of course, your chart of accounts is different, but all my chart of accounts. I put in a 6 because I know my account number starts with a 6, and I press F5. You see now it starts with a 6. Just plain old list, but if I want to do a search, description, then I've got the option. I've got 2 options. I can use contains or starts with. So starts with is going to be a little faster because it's just going to look at the first few characters of the description. But if you don't know what the name, what it starts with, you might want to use contains. So say I know it's going to be insurance, so I'm just going to put INS. I'm going to put part of my word, and here it brings up insurance. I'm just going to do insurance, and that is my distribution. Okay. Another option that might be used is distribution set. Now, I'm using the Finder again, and I'm going to pick that office supplies one that we talked about. That'll show up when we enter an invoice. Save, and that's distribution, all right? Once again, the duplicate invoice, vendor and amount, vendor and date, that comes from the vendor group, but once again, of course, you can change it at the vendor level. Just remember the vendor group sets defaults, but those defaults can be overwritten for exceptions. Tax group, again, it's always going to be the same because you're not tracking that. Retainage fields you will not have, okay? 1099 reporting. Actually, I'm going to turn this off. 1099 reporting, this is where you set that up. So you choose whether that vendor is 1099able. It's a yes or a no, or either it is or it isn't. And you put in their tax ID, and we'll just do something like this. And then you tell what type. You tell us what type. So it's either an employee ID or a social security, unless you're Canadian, GST, business number, or social insurance. That's all Canada or different countries. So for us, it's only going to be social. And then you save that. There you go. Optional fields, once again, you can set that up. This is for vendor optional fields. So you can see in this example, we've got things like discount level, notes, purchase, whatever. At this point, you're not tracking optional fields at the vendor level. Just remember, optional fields are fields for anything that you don't have, that you want to track that's not otherwise available in AP. So if there's some way you want to track your vendors and the field does not exist in AP, that's optional. Statistics are added to every time you post. They're maintained by period and by year. So 2019, you can see stats show up for 2019. Reminder to any year, okay? And there they are. Once again, you can edit it if that option is turned on in your setup options, but generally you don't want to. More statistics are your activity, such as highest balance, largest invoice, last payment and date, last credit note, etc. Total invoices paid, date to pay. And then vendor comments you can set up. You can set them up to, any kind of comment or note that you want. So if I insert, I'm hitting the insert key. It adds the session date and the expiration date. If you have a follow-up date, you can add that here, and then just say credit note. I don't know. These are just vendor notes that you can keep and, kind of keep a record of any communication. It's sort of like mini CRM, kind of thing. right? Remit to location. So if your vendor sends you an invoice, but your remit to goes somewhere else, like maybe to a lockbox or something else like that, this is where you would set up your remit to. So for vendor 1200, we've got 2 remit to locations set up. So I'm going to open this one. And so, you can give it a code. I think it's a 6-character code, and then a description. This description is going to actually be what prints on your check. So make sure it is what you want it to be. And then you just put your address and all that kind of thing. So that's your remit to. You can also specify that something is a primary remit to, so by default, any invoice you enter is going to show or is going to select that remit to address. So I'm going to choose this remit to as my primary, so you'll see that come up when we enter an invoice later for vendor number 1200. So to add a new, you just simply choose a vendor, you click new, fill in your information, and hit vendor activity. So this screen is something you're going to want to use a lot. This is where you look up activity for a vendor. So if a vendor calls and says, hey, invoice number 102 is a little bit late, what's going on? You can say, well, let me check. I'm going to put the vendor number in, and it shows your outstanding balance. And then here, you can look up all outstanding items. So I'm going to maximize the screen, and you can say, oh, yes, that one was paid on, yesterday or whatever. So it shows the original amount of the invoice, any discount, whatever has been applied. Like you can see here, there might be a credit note and the current balance. So if I double click, I click on details, it's going to show my original info for the vendor, and it's going to show me the GL distribution. Okay. If I click on document, it's going to take me to my original batch entry. Okay, so it's going to show, okay, this is the GL I used, here's all the information on, here's who entered it, and here's the total amount, and so on. If I click on open, it's going to show me my original amount, and it's going to show me anything that's been applied. So you can see in this example, there's 2 credit notes that have been applied on these dates. So that's pretty much everything you wanted to know about that document. If I choose include fully paid and I hit go, then I can look up a payment, this one, which has a current balance of 0, and we can say open, and it's going to show me the document date, and this is my payment date, and here's my check number 123. So yeah, so that's basically how that works. Vendor inquiry. Also look up payments. So this is all transactions, and you can choose transactions you're looking for. So if you're a payment or an invoice, you can restrict searching for. You can also choose how you sort. So I want to sort by document number. Maybe I want to sort by document date. So when I hit the go button, you notice now we're sorting by document date. Okay. I can say I don't want to look at anything that's older than January 1st. So in sample data, that's 2020. That's going to reduce what I have to sift through when I'm looking for this information. And then if you get your screen the way you want it, say you always want to sort by document date, I always want to start with January 1, and I don't want to have to type this in every single time I do a search, then I can click on settings and then save settings as default. So I'm going to save that setting. I'm going to close the screen, and now when I go back in, see, I go to transactions, my settings, it's still sorting by date, and it starts at 1120. The save settings will save your settings, but it's not going to affect other users. So this is saved by the user. You can also rearrange fields. So if you always want to look at, I always want to look at date, and then I want to look at my original amount, slide, and then I want to balance. You know, you can see I'm just rearranging fields here. I'm just grabbing the column and moving it. So that's something that you can set up so it's the way you want to look at it, and then just go save settings as defaults, and then you're good. You can also make the columns wider. Now let me just caution you. Sometimes people will lose columns in this screen and they can't figure out why. And the reason why is sometimes someone will accidentally hide a column. So see how I'm clicking between the columns, and I've got my double arrow, and then I've just lost my column and I can't figure out where it is unless I happen to just scroll along, and then you can see the double-headed arrow come up, and then, you know, I can reveal my posting date, but that's still kind of hard. So if you do something like this, and basically you've kind of screwed the screen up, all you have to do is say settings, clear save settings, and then you can redo your settings, okay? And you can notice my starting date, it's now, you know, set to the original default. If you end up losing a field, you know, you just clear save settings, and that'll put you back where you were, and then you can redo it. The last tab is checks. Once again, you can choose to order by check number or date, and this shows you check numbers and whether they've cleared the bank rec or not. So if I open, if I say I'm going to open, I'm going to click open, it's going to show that I took this check, $800, and I used it to pay these two documents, okay? So that shows what was paid, okay? And then, of course, if I click on document, it's going to open the batch entry screen for that original payment. That's vendor activity. And, of course, this is just your aging, you know, and you can change your dates here. Vendor activity, that's a screen you're probably going to be in a lot, okay? 1099 inquiry. Okay, so looking at your 1099 for the year 2020, this the from to nothing to ZZZZZ, that shows all vendors for all 1099 codes. You can see vendor 1200 has 3 1099 codes, okay? And you can see the payments that are made to those 1099 codes, right? So this is where you would edit. If maybe you had a vendor, you paid them, and you'd forgotten to include that amount on 1099, you can simply press insert. I just press the insert key, same vendor. It's going to be non-employee compensation, July 7th. And there were 4 payments, and the total was. You can edit your 1099 information here if there's a problem. And you just save. Yeah, and then you can also print that out. Okay, so here's my vendor, here's my codes, and then here's my code 3, 4, and 7 total. All right, so this is where you can take a look, make sure everything looks good before you print the 1099. That's important.
Yes.
Payables. So this is a big time saver. So if you've got monthly payables and they're always the same, you can set up recurring payables here. So the first thing you have to do in a recurring payable is define a schedule. So schedules are located not in AP, but in common services, because schedules can be used across all modules. Okay, so I'm going to look at common services, and I'm going to look at scheduling, and I'm going to look at schedules. Okay, so let's see what we have in sample data. A couple. I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to create, let's say we've got one that goes out on the 1st of the month. So I'm going to just call this M first and say monthly, 1st of the month. And I can choose to remind users, so you can do that or not. Okay, I'm going to say I'm going to remind all users, and I'm going to remind them 5 days in advance. And my schedule is going to start on May 31st. And then what is my recurring period? It's monthly, all right? And every what? Is it every 1 month, or maybe it's quarterly? It would be every 3 months. And then what day? So all my choices for dates from the 1st all the way to the 31st. Then the last would be, you know, so that if it's February, it will be the 28th, or either the 30th or the 31st. That's it. I'm going to add that. So maybe we'll do an M last. A month. And 5 days in advance is fine. Every month, every 1 month. And then I'm going to choose the last day. So this is pretty flexible. You could do it weekly, semi-monthly, you know, yearly, every 3 months, every 6 months, you know, anything you need. And then you just save it, and that's that. So there's my schedule. And now that we've defined a schedule, now we can go back and we can create a recurring payable, which once again is under vendors. So let's just say we have a company car, and it goes to GM, and I don't know, and it's going to be vendor 1200, and my recurring. So this is going to be GM 2017 van. Okay. Schedule code, it's due on the 1st of the month, so we'll use month M first. The start date will be 0501, okay? And then the account set, that's just coming from the vendor. There's not going to be an expiration, or maybe there is. Maybe it's going to be a 3-year van, or a 3-year loan. So it's going to be 0401 2023. Remit to, it's going to be, you know, that's going to be your bank. The remittance, okay, the description would be GM. It's not going to be a 1099 for this. A due date, or no, it's due upon receipt. We'll do that. No 1099. Details. So then we're going to choose what we are using. So in this example, we're just going to use a distribution code because that's what the vendor has. Didn't use this for a car loan, but for the purposes of discussion, so we'll just call this office supplies, which would be completely inappropriate. It'll be a $500 a month payment. So that sets up your recurring payable. You can do it again if you've got rent or any other kind of thing that's the same every month, all right? So just to review, you first choose a schedule, or you set up a schedule, and then you set up the recurring with the appropriate GL distribution, and then at the appropriate time you run the recurring payables. One thing to note about schedules, I don't recommend doing these super specific schedules like calling one car loan or something like that, because you can use the schedules across Sage. So using something like M1st or M15 for the 15th of the month or whatever makes it more generic, and then you have you know, dozens and dozens.
Like everything due on the 1st. If we have a lot of leases, rents, all things that are due on the 1st, it makes it easy.
Call it rents. That's a good example. Because then you end up with all these codes and they're the same. You know, you might have rents and then you might have leases. Well, just call it M1st, and then you only have to maintain one schedule. So I like to keep things kind of lean, and that allows you to do that. Okay. All right. So now we've talked about setup, and we've talked about vendors. So we're going to take a quick glance at setup and vendor reports, and then we're going to get into transactions. The setup reports simply list all the things that are in your setup. So for instance, if you want to print out your terms, I'm going to just print them to the screen. And, you know, it's just setup information. So probably not something you're going to really need to print out often, but if you do, that's where you do it. Since we're talking about printing, let's chat about print destination. Print destination can be found by either clicking File, Print Destination, or by clicking on the print destination icon, which is down on the lower right of your status bar. So just looking at this, I can tell that I've got Print to Preview selected. So if I double click on it, the same thing comes up. You tell the system whether you want to printer to preview or to a file like a PDF or to email. Report paper size tells the system to use report orientation and paper size created in the by the person who wrote the report. And then, of course, your default should be letter and A4 because we're not printing to legal. Who has legal in their printer? I don't, you know. So that's your print destination, okay? So those are your setup codes, and then on the same token, in here are your vendor reports. So vendor groups, vendors. If you print your vendors, you can choose what you're printing, such as vendor activity statistics, period statistics, or just vendor info. You might print addresses. You might want to include the profile. You might just want to print comments. And if you do comments, you can choose a range of follow-up dates. So you might want to say, I want to print all my comments that have follow-up dates for this week or this month. You maintain. And then, of course, you can select by number, and, you know, you put in your range from to. If you're just printing one vendor, you might say 1,200 to 1,200. And if I choose address and comments, and I'll just print that to the screen. Profile information, and then comments, okay? It's self-explanatory. Remit to locations, that's just a printout of those remit to addresses. Recurring payables that you've set up. We can look at our one that we just set up, the van. So there it is, all the information, start date, end date, and amount, okay? We won't have this tax information, the sample data calculates tax, but so. Letters and labels, if you want to do a mailing to your vendors, you can print labels. If you want to do letters, you can do the same. All right, the CPRS you'll never use because we're not in Canada, but you will use the 99 forms. So let's print and take a look at what they take. Whatever. Fun with sample data. So, all right, so there's our sample company. Here's my 1099. Of course, this would print out on pre-printed forms, and it would print in the appropriate box based on, you know, what type you've selected, usually non-employee compensation. Okay, so that's where you're going to print out your 1099. All right, so those are vendor reports. So now let's talk about transactions. All right, so you've got all the kinds of transactions here that you can do in AP. So invoice batch list, payments, adjustments, and then payment batch. This would be a check run. So let's first talk about invoices. I like to work from the batch list because you can pretty much do everything from it. If I open this, I can view unposted batches. I can also view posted batches by checking this little check mark here. You can see posted batches, nothing in the ready to post column because it's already posted. So if you wanted to look up an existing batch that was posted, you can look it up. You can see all the fields are dimmed, posted. Okay. I'm going to uncheck that. I'm going to create a new batch now. All right, so I like to put a description. So whatever you want, you could just put, you know, week of whatever. The batch date is going to default to your session date, which is what you log in with. And I'm just going to tab. And my entry number, that's just assigned by the system. So you just tab through. You can put a description if you want, optional. And vendor number. Once again, you can use the finder, or if you know the vendor number, remit to location comes up automatically because for this vendor, we assigned the remit to location CTAC as the default or the primary remit to, okay? So otherwise, this would be blank. Document type, invoice, debit note, credit note, interest. You will never have these retainage. So an invoice, of course, is what it sounds like. It's an invoice. Debit note is going to be pretty much an adjustment to increase the balance of an invoice. A credit note would decrease the balance of an invoice, and interest, of course, is what it sounds like. It's interest. So an invoice, we will give it a document number. This is coming from the vendor. The document date, of course, that's going to be the invoice date. And notice the posting date defaults to the same as the invoice date. That's because in options, we selected document date and posting date to be the same, okay? So the posting date is going to determine when it hits general ledger, okay? So that's really important because, you know, that's going to affect the balance in the GL. Typically, it's going to be the same. But if you have a month end with a very hard cutoff and you get a, say on the 15th, you get an invoice dated for the 30th of the prior month, you might say, well, you know, I've already closed last month, so the posting date is going to have to be this month. So that is when you would have a different posting date than document date. PO number, if you have one, you can put it in. Okay, and then 1099 code. If this is a 1099able item, that'll default. And order number, again, is an optional field, so you can put anything you want. And then the document number, $150. And notice what happens amount. It defaults to the same amount. Typically, what. All right, so now we're in our distribution information. So, you know, so this is where we're going to choose our GL account. So I'll just choose one. I'm going to 125 here. Now, this particular vendor has tax. I'm just going to change that. Won't have to do this, but stuck with sample data. So now the undistributed amount is 0. So when you have an invoice, you put the total amount up here, and then you put the lines of distribution below with the GL. You can put descriptions if you want, and you know, just information about the line item. That's optional. And then you should see the undistributed amount hit 0, and then you know you've got everything.
We have a distribution set for the use tax in ours.
Okay, so that's
it
fine.
Throws
so
the GL code. I'll show them when they come in to see me this
we can
morning.
do an example with a distribution set. So
okay.
Here's the same vendor, and it's going to be invoice ABC 13, no purchase order number, $. And now here's my office distribution set. So you can see it comes up. You're just going to hit create distribution, and it puts your GL in. And then you just go down. We'll just say 75, 25. And again, your undistributed amount would grow. Doing the sales tax data, show everything. Now my
we're actually hitting a debit and a credit.
Okay, so then
one's a credit and one's a debit.
Okay, so 125, and then we'll say minus 5. You see I have the minus. So now my distribution is still adding up to the $100.
Right.
Yep. So the one thing I want to just remind everybody, in here you will only ever put assets or, you know, whatever GL account, but you'll never, ever, ever put in the AP control account, because the AP control account is credited or debited automatically. Is the other side. So whatever this total is on this total screen, that's going to be your, in this example, a credit to accounts payable. Sometimes I've just run into a couple times where people will put that AP control account in the distribution area, and what that ends up doing is debiting and crediting AP, so you have a net amount of 0. Your GL is out by that amount, and it's really difficult to figure out why. So,
Carol, can I lock that account down so no one can, so it's not a postable account?
You can do it in GL, but accounts payable, you can't. So just never use it in AP. But when it's rolling in the GL and everything's entered, yes, you can lock it out. The only thing that can hit AP is AP. But that does not stop somebody from using AP within AP, which you should never do. You know, that typically happens like in credit notes. You know, people say, well, I'm crediting AP. Well, no, you're actually not. You're crediting an expense, and the automatic other side is going to be a debit to AP. So now we're talking about credit notes. So let's look at credit notes. So we'll use our same vendor, and our document type is going to be a credit note. So something's going to pop up right here when I choose credit note. So here's credit note. And now you can see apply to document. So my credit note is going to be CN 123456. And I'm going to apply it to what? So what we want to do in the credit note is we actually want to apply it to something. Otherwise, you're just going to have this credit note hanging out that's not being applied to anything. So if you know what you're applying it to, if you've got an invoice that's already posted in the system and you know that, then you're going to save yourself a step by choosing that right here. So I'm using the Finder. I see here's an invoice, right? For 100 or for 228, and get to that. My document totals we'll just say $28, and we'll give it a GL account number. A description. tax, so I'm going to have to fix that. Credit note, again, with a credit note, you don't put a minus here because the fact that it's a credit note, the system already knows that it's a minus. Fix my tax, which of course you won't have to do. Save that. And okay, just remember that that original invoice, this one right here, I'm going to look it up again, was $228.76. So just remember that, okay? And it was 126 something. Right, so we'll look at that in vendor activity. So now we've got our whole batch. You can see just by looking that you've got 3 entries. It was created, entered by admin. Of course, it would have your user ID here. The total amount for the batch is $222. I'm happy with it. I can either post it from here, or I can go back to my batch list, set it ready to post, and click post. If you don't set a batch ready to post, you're just going to get a little message. So it's going to say, not ready to post, do you want to post it? And you'll just say yes. I set it ready to post, I don't get that message. So I can post, GL creation, it's created a GL transaction, all is good. Now, you can see now that my ready to post column is empty. That's because it's already been posted. And if I open this up, it shows my status as being posted. Open this up and you can see I can look at it, but everything is grayed out. I cannot change because it's posted. All right, you can scroll through and so on. Now, if we go and look at vendor 1200 in vendor activity, you can now see actions. And let's open this up. And so here's my $228 invoice. I've applied $28 and now I have a balance of $200. So you can see since I chose to apply that credit note to that invoice, you can see that it's applied right here. Now this credit note here does not appear to have been applied to anything. So this is just kind of an open credit note. Yeah, you can see it's not applied to anything. There's no apply to document. That sometimes happens if you don't know what you're going to apply it to, you know, and that's perfectly fine. So we'll look at how to apply when we get to payment. So the next kind of transaction we're going to look at is payments. So there's a couple ways to do payments. You can enter them in one by one, which is convenient if you just need to quick get an AP checkout, or you can create a payment batch. So I'm going to show you the one-by-one method first, and then I'm going to show you how to create a payment batch. So I'm going to go to payment batch list, and I'm actually going to delete this generated check. I want to create those again. Now I'm going to click new. And the date will be whatever today's date is. Vendor 1200. So there's a couple things I can do. An invoice that's outstanding. Okay, so that's payment. I can create a prepayment. I can apply a document, or I can do a miscellaneous payment. So I'm going to show you all of those ways. So with payment, I'm just calling up my vendor and my remit to. And then I'm going to hit this little button, which is the go button. Oh, I'm going to maximize. So you can see this is everything that's due for this particular vendor. So you can see we've got a lot of invoices, we've got a lot of credit notes, and you can now also change up how you do this. So you can choose, I only want to see invoices, so if I hit go, you know, now the credit notes aren't showing, or you can hit on. You can order by document number, so you can get sorting by document. Also sort by due date. I think that's kind of useful. So we have due date, so now it's sorting by that, and the due date's way over here. Okay. If you want to see the due date, you just grab the column. You can say, I actually want to see that. You can see it's ordered now by due date. We can order by PO number. If you're tracking POs, sometimes that's really helpful, but if you're not, it's not. Same with the order number. You can also sort by document date. So if I scroll way over document date, I'll move that over too. Once again, you can change up the screen, and again, whatever Peach does is not going to affect what else is looking. So this is all by user. And then, of course, you can order by current balance. I want to see sorted by balance. So the negatives are first, and then the bigger ones follow. Last but not least, original document number. Typically, people do due date or document. But, you know, whatever you all want, it's fine. So I'm going to just I'm going to pay this invoice. Okay, so let's see. We have a $200 invoice here. And here's an open credit note. I'm going to take that credit. See, now if I scroll down, now my payment amount is $200. If I just double click or use the space bar, select, you can see the space bar, it's just a toggle. You can see that balance, the check amount go down once I tab out. You can see now the payment's going to be $60. I'm just manually picking and choosing, you know, what I'm paying. These are the only invoices I want to pay. That's great. So I'm going to add that one.
Carol, I was putting something together and kind of missed something here. Do we have a report by doing this, a payment requirement report?
Yeah, I haven't shown you transaction reports yet. This is basically when you just, oh gosh, I got to quick get a check out. I don't want to do a whole check run, but I need to get this invoice paid now. Okay. So that's do a manual kind of situation, okay? I'm just showing you the manual ways to create batches of payments. All right, so I'm actually going to delete this error. Perfect. So now I'm going to do, so that's the payment. Now I'm going to do a miscellaneous payment. That's when you've got someone hands you a vendor invoice and says, I need you to get me a check for this now. It's not an AP. So rather than going in and entering the invoice and posting it, you're just going to do all of that on the fly. So I'm going to go vendor 1200, and I'm going to choose my payment code, which will be default. Give it an invoice number. And now you can see, now we've got a GL account. So instead of picking invoices that are existing in the system, we're actually creating that liability and then paying it all at the same time. So we'll use account 6,000. It's going to be $150. Faxing. Data. Now we've got a $150 check that I'm going to add, all right? So that's a miscellaneous payment. So once again, you're paying one invoice that has not yet been entered AP. Now, another thing you can do with miscellaneous payment, and I don't know if your policy will, you know, this is a company policy thing. You may or may not do this. So this would be a one-time vendor, and you're never going to pay them again. So you're going to do a miscellaneous payment. You're going to leave the vendor number blank, and you're just going to say Joe Smith Associates or whatever. And your reference is consulting, whatever. Here's your invoice number, description, or your GL account. And will be $100. Add that. So that would be a miscellaneous to a non-vendor. Now, understand that with this, you will not have any kind of record in a vendor account because you haven't created a vendor account. So what some people actually do is they create a miscellaneous vendor and then just change the remit to address so that you have that record in that miscellaneous vendor. So I don't know what your policy is internally, but that's how those are options. Now, the print check, this is checked by default, but if it's a manual check that someone wrote and you're just entering it, you would just uncheck this and say it's check number, or the check number on print because you've already assigned the check number. Okay. The next thing you can do with the payment batch is apply a credit note. So this is going to be apply document. It's going to be vendor 1200. And we're going to choose the document. So let's find one, unapplied credit note. Up. So here's the $40.59 credit note. I'm going to choose that one. And then I'm going to hit go. And these are all my open invoices. Now, you can see the first two invoices have pending. That means that there is a pending payment, all right? So if I go across, you can see the current balance, the original amount, and then a pending payment. And that pending payment happens to be in this very batch, okay? So I'm going to assign this credit note of $40 to this $140 invoice, all right? So I'm just going to add that. So that's how you can take a credit note that was never applied to anything and then assign it and apply it, okay? All right, so those are the ways these are all the ways of all the options for checks within the system, okay? So then the next thing you would do is close that. You could print a batch listing, so you can print and review, put on screen. And here we are doing, and you know, this is the total and all my information, okay? Now, so if you recall, we have 4 entries in the batch. 2 were print checks to be printed, 1 was apply document, and 1 was a manual check that we had handwritten. So when I hit print post, it's going to bring my check printing screen up, okay? And this is where we're going to print checks. So are you guys using Print Boss? Do you know, Peach?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, we are.
Okay. So what's going to happen on this screen, you will have a check stock code, maybe it'll be PB or something like that, and that comes from your bank. You want to make sure that's right, and it should just default. And then your check advice form will be probably something like AP-CK1, but once again, that'll be specified in bank services. And then your next check number, that's going to come automatically as well. So I'm going to print this. I'm going to pretend that I'm going to print it. So we're going to print it on, it's going to first print to the screen. And then, you know, here are all my, this is my check stub. So this would be my invoice number. It can show that I applied this credit note, my total, $1,900. And then if I go, here's my other check for $150, okay? And let's just pretend I printed that. And what you would do, I don't think I have this on my system, but what you would do when you print it, you will always print it to the Print Boss printer driver. So it'll be Print Boss 50, okay? And what happens is Print Boss will receive all this information from accounts payable, and then it's going to generate a check image based on your vendor information. It'll create the, and it'll print right on your blank check stock, and it'll put the bank micro encoding, the routing number, all that stuff. So I'm sure Jim will go through that with you, you know, when you guys go live. But yeah, so your print, it'll always be Print Boss 50, okay? And then, so you'll print it, and then when you close this print preview, you will get this question: were all checks printed successfully? You will never say no until all of those checks are in your hand, okay? So, you know, if you've got like 50 checks printing out, wait till the printer stops and wait till you've got them all, because if the printer jams and you say yes, then you're going to have to reverse those checks because they didn't actually print okay. So that's an important thing. Just wait, because once you say yes, posting, okay? So batches, then you're going to post this batch. So yes, and now the 3 checks that we printed are now within that vendor, now permanent to that vendor. Okay, so that's how you manually create a check batch. So the next thing we're going to look at, we'll skip payment inquiry for the moment, but now we're going to look at generating a system check batch. Actually, you know what? I'm going to back up and look at transaction reports now that we've learned how to enter invoices. So your batch listings, those are just printouts of your batches, like invoice, payment, or adjustments, and then you choose which one you want to print out, and that'll look just like the print preview I showed you earlier. So look at the batch that we created earlier. Okay. And then take a look. And there it is, okay? That's my invoices that I entered, batch listing. Batch status, that's just a record of all your invoice batches, payment batches, or adjustment. It's not a thing you're gonna need to print often, but here's what it looks like. So this shows batch number 9. It came for purchase orders. There was 1 entry. Here's the batch date, was edited, posted, etc., totals. So it's just basically, it looks like your batch list screen, you know, where you actually enter. Posting journals, these are, so there's 2 kinds of things. There's your batch listing and then your posting journal, and that's a listing of what actually posted in accounts payable. So once again, you can choose invoice or payment or adjustment. You can choose how you want to sort it. We'll do by batch number. And we'll look at that last invoice batch that I created. Here's my posting sequence. So that shows what was actually posted in AP. Sometimes this printout could differ from your original batch listing, because if there's some sort of problem that AP runs into at the time of posting, like say a fiscal period was closed or there was an invalid GL account or something, maybe somebody made the vendor inactive after you'd entered the batch or something, what it would do is it would roll it forward and create an error batch. And an error batch contains any transactions that are posted in error, okay? And then that allows you to go into that error batch, fix whatever the problem was, and then you can repost it. So to look at posting errors, you would simply go into transaction reports, posting errors, choose what kind of posting it was, and then print that out. I don't know if there are any in the sample data. There aren't. But it would tell you exactly what the problem was, you know, like inactive vendor, or, you know, whatever, okay? Jumping back, your check register, we can just print that out. And you can choose by posting sequences, okay? So here's your vendor number and all the information of the check posted to that vendor, okay? Busy report. GL transactions, that's never going to have anything in it, because when you post, it's going to directly post and send the info to the GL. So that you'll never have anything there. We talked about posting errors, transactions for a specific vendor. I go 01 and I choose that. Then I can choose what kind. Maybe I just want to look at few. So this just shows my invoices, purchase order number, document date, due date, batch number, balance, transaction amount, and current balance. Transactions. Age payable. So this is what Peach was asking for. So if I go in here, I'm going to do an age payable, and you want to age it as of whatever date you want, and then you want to cut off by. Now the cutoff date will be typically whatever the current day is, unless you want to go back and you want to say, I want to do a report that's going to try out to the GL. If you want to do by the GL, you probably want to choose posting date, because posting date or year period, because those two are what has been sent to the GL. So if you ever have an invoice date that differs from the posting date, and you do this by document date, then you might not tie out to the GL. So just be aware of that. If you're doing an aging in order to tie out to the GL, then you want to use one of these options. If you're doing an aging to see what you owe, then you want to use the document date option. And then, of course, typically you're going to want to choose all vendors. You're going to probably want to include vendors or transactions on hold, especially if you're trying to tie out to the GL, because, of course, you want to include those on hold transactions. I'm going to hit print. And you can also do by summary or by detail. I'll show you both. We'll start by detail. And here we are. Here's my age payable. So it lists all my individual invoices. Scroll down to the end. Here is my grand total and my aging. Now, if I want to do summary, because that's a long, long report, I can simply hit summary, and this trims things up a lot. So now you see your aging categories for each vendor. All right, so that is your aging. Now the next option here is age cash requirement. So once again, that's similar to an aging, but it's got a little different twist. It's looking out at future periods to see what kind of money you're going to need for those periods. So you might say, I want 30, 60, 90, or you might want to say, well, I want to do this by the week. So I want 7, 14, over 21, because maybe you don't know what you're going to owe in 2 months. And I want to include vendors on hold, and I'm going to hit age cash requirements. Self-explanatory. The other way you could look at this, again, of course, is in summary. Up considerably. You can see in the next week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, and over 21 days and total. Okay, and then, you know, if you have this report and you have it set up the way you want, once again, you can save settings, and then next time you replay all of this. The only thing I'll caution you about this is it also saves your dates. So, you know, then you change the date next week or next month. Age retainage you do not have, so we will skip that. Now back to our AP transactions. So now we're going to create a payment batch. So this is where you create, actually, you know what, I'm going to show you control payments first. So control payments, so say you've got vendor number 1200, and say you've got a payment and you want to change something up about this particular invoice. So let's just pick one. Here. I'm going to hit go. So it shows everything about the invoice. It shows the document type, the document date, the total balance. So if you're disputing an invoice, but you want to pay part of it, you could set a payment limit. So you can say, I only want to pay $1,400 on this one. Or maybe you keyed the due date in wrong. So maybe you want to change the due date. I want to actually make that 5/31. Maybe I forgot to put in a discount. You know, you can change all these things to do with the payment of that invoice. Or maybe I want to put the whole thing on hold, and that's how you get an invoice on hold. Or maybe it's not due date, or it's not due today, but I want to force it. You know, I want to pay it early. So this is everything you can do with payment control. So what I've done is I've changed the due date and I put a payment limit on it, and I'm going to just click process. Now that has saved those changes, right? So that's how you manage that. So let's say, let's look at another invoice. So this one I'm going to put on hold, okay? So this is a $152 invoice. I'm going to just place that one on hold. Oh, great, it's already paid. Bad example. Nice. Clear that out, and then I can choose one that has a current balance. And processing complete. Okay, so now that one's on hold. Now, if I pop back into my transaction reports and I look at age payables for vendor 1200, I'm going to select vendor 1200, 1200, and I want to include vendor transactions hold of this. Show this one, see the little H, it shows that that item is on hold, okay? That is how that works. So now we are going to create a payment batch. Now that we've fixed up all of our things in the accounts payable, all our transactions, we've put holds on some, we've forced some, we've changed due dates on others, we can now create a payment batch. So your selection code, I'm actually going to clear this out. So I'm going to choose my selection code, and you recall in setup we created our selection codes, all vendors, inventory only, or whatever. I'm just going to choose all. I'm going to choose my bank here. I'm going to look at my criteria. So you have to fill this in. So I want due on or before 05/31. Maybe I only want forced documents. Okay, that would just be that forced item. Maybe I want to restrict it to just one vendor. I would set that up here. Or maybe I just want to do all. Maybe I don't want to send anything over $10,000. Okay. Maybe I want to exclude vendor number 1350. Okay, so you can do all these things for this batch only. So when you make these changes, it's going to affect this batch and this batch only, but the next time you run a payment batch, it will not affect anything. So before I generate this, I want to make sure it's what I want. So now I'm going to click on register, and it's going to give me a pre-check register for this run. So this is showing me all the vendors that I am paying. Okay, so it's going to take this credit note for this vendor, and remember the $1,400. So here's my net payable, but we put a restriction on that we're only paying $1,400, and we also changed the due date. Okay, that's why this got picked up. And then here's our other checks. Review this, and you can see the total payable, and then my withheld payables, if any. And if I'm happy with this, that's fine. But say, you know, I'm not going to pay vendor $2,150. Go back and I can include $2,150. Okay, now I go back to register. See $2,150. You can see all the vendors listed on the left. So you can see $2,150 is no longer there. So that's what you can do with the pre-check register. And once again, we'll check our totals. I'm happy with that. And now I'm going to close this. And now I'm going to generate. So now it's telling me payment batch 37 was generated. And now I'm going to go into payment batch 37, and we can see system batch, payment batch here. And here it is. So, you know, if you scroll through, you can see these are all the checks that you want to pay. Now, at this stage, you can still make changes, assuming that the allow edit of system batches is checked. You can actually still make changes. So say, you know, I actually don't want to pay this invoice. I'm going to just delete this, using the delete key. So now I've changed that, and I'm going to save it. And now let's say I'm happy with this. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to click print post. And here is my list of checks that are going to get printed. And you want to kind of review that. You want to check your next check number, and then you're going to hit print. Here's my checks once again. And then you'll send that out to Print Boss. Okay. Now, once you finish printing, you can close this, and it's going to say were all checks printed successfully. Let's say some were and some weren't, or let's say none of them were. You would say no, and then you can see the check status here is set to printed. So I'm just double clicking or pressing the space bar to change that to not printed. Let's say the printer jammed and the last 5 were not printed properly, okay? And let's say I'm not quite ready to print these checks yet, or whatever. If I close this window here, it's going to give me this message. Not all checks have been printed. Do you want to cancel the check run, voiding all previously printed checks? Now, if you say no, what's going to happen is your batch is going to be kind of stuck in this check printing in progress situation, and you're going to have to finish this thing up before you can go forward, or before you can do anything with the batch. So right now I'm just going to hit cancel, and I'm not going to actually leave this check run. So now I'm going to reprint, and it's going to just reprint these handful of checks that were not printed properly. Okay. Now here they are. There they are. I'm going to close. And now I'm going to say, yes, they were printed properly. Now it's going to ask me if I want to post my batch. And at this point, I'm going to say yes. So I'm going to say yes. So there, that's how you do a check batch, a system check batch in accounts payable. The last thing we need to chat about is payment inquiry, and once again, that's in your payment inquiry or in your transactions area. And so you can restrict the screen, say you're only looking up one vendor, or you're looking up a specific check, or you want to look up something from this month. Okay, and then you hit go. Gives you that query. Maybe you just want vendor 1200. Recalculating. So what this shows you, it shows you your check number. Let's make that wider. It shows you the date, the posting date, the year, the vendor number, etc., and then the payment amount. And then if I double click on one of these and I hit document, I can see what document it paid. So I can see it paid invoice number 100-01, and you know, basically that's that. And it also tells you if it's been cleared by the bank or not. So if a vendor calls you, you can, you know, say, you know what, it cleared on 5/31/2020, or yeah, that check's outstanding. Let me see what's going on, or whatever. So payment inquiries, very helpful feature. One thing just to understand is the system does assign leading zeros. So if you're doing a from to check number, if I just say, give me from check 123 to 123, going to not give me anything because there are a bunch of leading zeros. So it's best to use the finder for this. There's my 123. So that's just something to be aware of, is it does assign some leading zeros. So call and say, I can't, get this screen to work, and that's because they've forgotten about that. That's payment inquiry. Actually, I lied. There is one more thing I want to show you, and that's how to reverse a check. So if you have a check that's been posted and for whatever reason you need to reverse it, what you do is you go into bank services, and this of course assumes if you've got the rights to get into bank services, but whoever's going to be doing that, what you're going to do is you're going to choose reverse transactions. So you're going to choose the bank, and then you're going to choose what application the transaction came from, and in your case it's always going to be accounts payable rather than AR or bank services. Then you could say the reason lost in mail, pick the vendor number. The reversal date, by the way, is going to determine what date it hits the GL and what date it goes back into AP. You can choose any check number that has not cleared the bank, all right, this one. And then you check the amount, make sure it's correct, and you hit post. All right, I have to fix that. So, wait. There, so that does that. So what happens when you post a reversal? Of course, it puts the cash back into the bank. It puts the liability back into AP. So what will happen is next time you have a check run, that invoice will be picked up. If you want to totally eliminate the invoice, you don't actually want to pay it, then you would need to do a credit note to get rid of that liability. The other thing you can do is reverse multiple payments. So if I do that, this would allow you to just check a whole bunch of payments that would show up in a list, and you check them off, and you could select them and then reverse them. So if you had a check run that something got screwed up and you accidentally said yes, that they had all printed correctly and you had posted them, this is where you would reverse like a whole check run, a whole batch of. So that's everything for accounts payable. And that was a lot, I know. Do you guys have any questions?
I don't. Hello?
Carol?
Yes.
Hello.
Hey,
No questions?
I do have one. From a reviewer standpoint, you went through everything, like from a transactional standpoint, really well. And I was wondering, from like a review standpoint, is there quick, easy reports that we can see what's outstanding or hung up in the system, or?
Yeah, so what's outstanding, what you would do is you would look at under AP transaction reports, you'd go to aged payables. And once again, you choose what aging period, whether you want to cut off by date, document date, or if you're looking to review the GL balance and make sure it ties out, then you're going to choose posting date or year period. And then you're going to choose the appropriate cutoff date. So if I want to say, I want to look at AP and compare it to, for August, say, and I want to age it as of August 31, okay, and I want all vendors. I want to include transactions on hold, because if you don't include them, then it's not going to tie out to the GL. Because they're on hold, so that means they're not going to get picked up in the check. They are in the GL. So, and then you'll just print that, and this is going to be detail. Go, and if you can see, this one's on hold. I'm just going to go to the last page, and it's going to give you your whole aging plus your total payables. Or if you want a more top-level view, you can do summary. Once again, include vendors on hold, and you can hit print. I can do a nice summary view of your aging periods and your grand total, which should tie out to the general ledger. Okay. The other thing you may want to do as a reviewer is, if you need to investigate vendor transactions, that report can be useful. So you would give it a date range, maybe 1/1/20 to 12/31/20. And say you just look at one vendor, we can look at our 1200 to 1200. And you might want to choose vendors with a zero balance, because if you're doing a review of vendor transactions and that you don't owe them anything, well, you're going to want that info. And you want to include maybe fully paid transactions if you're looking. Maybe you want to sort by types. You want to see all the invoices and all the interest and the debit and the credit notes. That look. A little longer because it's going to give you everything, whether it's paid or not. So it's going to show you the amount. Here are all your credit notes. You can see the balances as well. So you can see of this range, all this information, which is here, vendor 1200, this is my date range, today's session date, etc. It's going to show you the transaction amount plus what you still owe, if anything. And then at the end, you can see your totals. And then, of course, this little key shows you the transaction key codes like CR's credit note, DB's debit note, IN, etc. So that is you might want to look at as someone who's reviewing or looking through, AP transaction history. Other thing as a reviewer, you'll want to probably spend some time in is vendor activity or 1099 inquiry. So once again, you'll choose your vendor number, and you can, this of course is vendor by vendor. This isn't company-wide. You'll look at your aging for that vendor, transactions, outstanding transactions. You can include fully paid. You can drill down to the document and look at your original entry. There it is. Okay, there's what I entered. Here's my GL. Of course, if you open this screen up, you can also see what you still owe, if anything, and what you paid or whatever. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think.
Is that a yes?
It was.
Good. Okay. Does anyone else have anything?
And we can go over everything in our meeting. And Carol, would you be available when we get down to actually doing a check run and all of that to take?
Depends on. I am away that the week for like 10 days between Christmas and then coming back the Friday after New Year's. So absolutely email me. I will be checking emails every day, and I don't mind. Okay. But I won't have my band is going to be so poor that I wouldn't be able to log in. But other people would, and going forward, if I'm in town, I'm absolutely available. And between me and Jim, I'm always available and happy to help. So.
Yeah, I kind of think when it gets down to it, a one-on-one with Katie and Avila would actually, I guess it's Avila will be doing primary payment processing,
Okay.
but good I think he might want one-on-one when it gets down to actually doing it.
Absolutely, so, yes. I know we've covered a lot, and I'm going to show you real quick some other things that I think Peach knows about this, but this is our website, okay? And if you go to support and you go to training videos, okay, there's a whole bunch of little free videos. Now, some of them are not going to apply, obviously, but some of them might. So you might want to take a look. I don't know if any of you are handling bank services, scheduling recurring transactions. So this is how to create a schedule and common services that we saw, earlier. Payroll you're not using, project job, multiple data entry. That's a generic thing, so you might want to look at that. Creating a shortcuts folder, I mean, that's hugely convenient. And I'll show you that real quick. So once again, this is by user. So say you want to not have to click around for things that you use frequently. So if I right click, I hit new, I'm going to create folder, and I'm going to call this Carol's Daily AP, whatever. You don't have to make all users available, you know, you can just have it for yourself, or if it's something you want to set up for the whole company, you can. I'm going to finish. And then in that, let's see, I want to look at invoice batch list. I'm going to right click, I'm going to copy, and I'm going to look at that Carol's Daily. I'm going to paste. Maybe I want to look at vendors, because maybe I create vendors on a regular basis. Maybe I create payment entries, or maybe, yeah, maybe I do a payment batch. That's something I do a lot. So, you know, within your own Sage desktop, which is this thing here, and then within AP, you can create your own folders that allow you to have quick access. You're not clicking all around, you know, forever. And another thing I'll show you is visual process flows. So these are, if you've ever worked with any kind of entry-level, actually, accounting software, they always have these little things that graphically take you from thing to thing, you know, from activity to activity. So they actually created this in Sage. So if I open this up for AP, so, all right, there's my AP transactions. So if I click on this, it's going to enter, it's going to open up my AP batch entry screen, okay? And then make payments, it's going to create my AP payment entry, all right? And then my reports, they're all here. My transaction reports, batch list, batch status, my analytical reports, aged payables, cash requirements, vendor transactions, inquiries, vendor records, okay? So you guys might want to use that, because as you're getting used to the system, this is a nice graphic that just kind of reminds you where everything is. And we can actually create custom graphics like this. So if you guys said, well, you know, I'd really like one that just had certain analysis things, you know, without this other stuff, or whatever, you know, you can do that. We can do that. So that's something, visual process flows. You want to make sure that you have access to that.
Okay.
So, yeah. So
Good.
I think probably everything. I am around for the next couple weeks, so
Okay.
run into anything, and you want to have a follow-up, that would be fine. And,
You know what might be great is if we could schedule an AP review for Avila